The gladiators found them in rows, dozens of pregnant women chained in underground cells beneath the villa. The splintering of wood echoed through stone corridors as Spartacus's men broke down door after door. October night, 73 BCE. The smell hit them, first human waste, fear, something medical and sharp, then silence. Complete silence from warriors who'd survived the arena's worst horrors. 40 cells. 3 women per cell, all of them showing. The rebels stood frozen in the doorway, torches throwing shadows across faces they couldn't process. These weren't typical slave quarters. The walls were too thick, the chains too short. The women couldn't stand fully upright or lie down properly. Some looked barely 15. A Thracian gladiator dropped his sword. The clatter rang through the underground chamber like an accusation. Nobody moved to pick it up. The women stared back with eyes that expected nothing. No rescue, no mercy. Just another inspection, another calculation. One girl in the corner cell, she couldn't have been older than 14, pressed protective hands over her swollen belly. The chains rattled with the movement. Spartacus himself hadn't spoken since they'd broken through the first door. Now, he moved between the cells, counting. His lieutenants watched their general's face change from confusion to recognition to something darker. They'd found stockpiles of weapons before. Gold, grain. Never this. How did the Roman Empire build an industrial system for breeding human beings? To understand why Spartacus made burning these facilities his top priority, we need to go back 20 years to when Marcus Crassus first put pen to parchment and calculated the exact profit margin of a teenage girl's womb. The scratching of Marcus Crassus's pen across parchment sounded like any merchant doing his accounts, but the numbers he wrote would make your blood freeze. Female, age 16, cost 2,000 sestertii. Expected yield 12,000 sestertii over 20 years. The richest man in Rome kept meticulous records, every expense itemized, every investment tracked. In his villa outside Rome, archaeologists found ledgers that survived 2 millennia. Most entries covered mundane purchases, wheat, wine, weapons. Then they turned the page. Breeding stock acquired from Thracian markets. The ink had faded, but the calculations remained clear. Purchase price per female, projected births per year, market value of offspring at various ages, deductions for mortality. The same formulas his managers used for cattle. But Crassus had found a way to triple those profits. His innovation was treating pregnancy like compound interest. A woman who cost 2,000 sestertii could produce a child worth 600 at birth. But if you kept that child and bred her at 14, she became another production unit. The math spiraled upward. One woman could generate 30,000 sestertii over 2 decades if you managed the breeding cycles properly. The ledgers showed monthly tracking, not names, numbers. Female, 273. Last cycle, 28 days ago. Paired with male 194. Female 312. Currently producing, estimated delivery within 10 days. Remove infant at birth for maximum recovery time. Crassus's accountants calculated everything. The cost of minimal food to maintain fertility without excess expense. The optimal age to begin breeding. Young enough for maximum production years but old enough to survive multiple births. The precise moment to separate mothers from infants to restart cycles. The most chilling entry in his ledger wasn't about money. Note on female 456. Third pregnancy failed. Recommend transfer to fieldwork. Replacement stock ordered from Damascus markets. A human being reduced to a line item. A woman whose body could no longer generate profit moved to a different column in the ledger. These weren't unique records. Every major estate kept similar books. The Roman economy depended on this arithmetic. Historians estimate that by Spartacus's time, 1 in 3 people in Italy were enslaved. But that number misses the darker truth. The empire needed constant replacement. Wars provided some bodies. Pirates sold others. But Roman elites had discovered that breeding humans was more reliable than capturing them. The profit margins were staggering. A male gladiator might cost 5,000 sestertii and die within a year. A female of breeding age cost half that and could produce 20 slaves over her lifetime. Each child born into slavery never knew freedom, never learned rebellion, never questioned their fate. Pure profit, from birth to death. What his accountants recommended next would become standard practice. Separate facilities. Underground chambers where women existed solely to produce. No other work that might interfere with pregnancy. No contact with male slaves except for breeding. No keeping infants that might slow the next cycle. The industrialization of human reproduction, calculated down to the last copper coin. Crassus owned 7 such facilities by the time Spartacus rebelled. His rivals owned dozens more. The senator Lucullus boasted that his breeding programs produced more profit than his silver mines. It became a mark of sophisticated management. Only primitive owners relied on capturing slaves. Modern Romans manufactured them. The mathematics were so precise that owners could predict annual yields. They factored in mortality rates for mothers and infants. They calculated the optimal ratio of breeding females to males. They even developed feeding schedules that maximized fertility while minimizing cost. One preserved tablet from a villa near Pompeii shows the complete formula. Initial investment plus maintenance costs divided by expected offspring minus mortality equals profit per year. Human lives reduced to an equation that any merchant could understand. But calculating profit was only step 1. The Romans had developed an actual science for maximizing human reproduction, and they wrote it all down in manuals that monks would carefully preserve for the next 1,000 years. In 37 BCE, Marcus Terentius Varro sat down to write a farming manual. Chapter by chapter, he covered wheat, olives, sheep. Then, using the exact same technical language, he explained how to breed human beings. The scratching of his pen filled the study as he wrote. On the breeding of slaves. No hesitation. No acknowledgement that these were people, just another chapter between livestock and crop rotation. His manual would survive 2,000 years, carefully preserved by medieval monks who copied every word. The female should begin breeding at 14 or 15 years. Varro wrote, earlier risks damage to the breeding stock, later wastes productive years. The same clinical tone he used for discussing when to mate sheep. He calculated that a healthy female could produce 1 offspring every 2 years for 20 years, 10 units of production per breeder. His recommendations grew more specific. Select males for strength and docility. Avoid matching aggressive temperaments as this trait breeds true. Agricultural science applied to human genetics. The optimal ratio is 1 male to 5 females, though some estates report success with 1 to 7. But Varro's manual revealed something darker than simple calculations. Breeding pairs should be kept separate, except during fertile periods. He detailed the signs estate managers should watch for, the optimal window for conception. How to track cycles using mark tablets. Once pregnancy is confirmed, remove the male to prevent damage to the developing product. The manual included feeding schedules. Pregnant females required 1/4 more grain to maintain fetal development. But Varro warned against overfeeding. Excessive nutrition produces larger infants, increasing mortality during delivery and damaging future breeding capacity. Medieval scribes copied these passages without comment. The manuscript passed through monastery libraries for centuries. Scholars praised Varro's systematic approach to agriculture. Nobody seemed to notice they were reading instructions for industrial-scale human breeding. Varro addressed common problems estate owners faced. Females who failed to conceive after 6 attempts should be sold to recoup investment. Those who produced only female offspring were less valuable but still profitable if the daughters survived to breeding age. Twins increased profit margins by 40%. Remove offspring immediately after birth. He instructed, the female will resist initially, but productivity depends on rapid cycle resumption. He recommended separate facilities for raising the young until market age. No contact between mothers and offspring. Sentiment reduced efficiency. The manual's most chilling section covered quality control. Varro explained how to identify defects early. Malformed infants should be disposed of before investment in feeding. Weak or sickly offspring weren't worth raising. He provided a checklist for estate managers. Physical deformities. Failure to thrive. Any sign of mental deficiency. Early culling prevents resource waste. His text influenced Roman agricultural practice for centuries. Estate owners quoted his ratios. They followed his feeding schedules. They implemented his separation protocols. What started as one man's manual became standard practice across the empire. Archaeological evidence confirms how widely Romans followed Varro's guidelines. Estate layouts match his recommended facility designs. Infant burial grounds appear exactly where his manual suggested placing them, far enough from breeding quarters to prevent disease, close enough for efficient disposal. But Varro went beyond basic breeding instructions. He developed a complete system for maximizing production, temperature controls for breeding chambers, optimal lighting to regulate cycles. Even music, he recommended flute players to calm the breeding stock during delivery. Maintain detailed records, Varro insisted. Each female numbered, every pregnancy tracked, birth weights recorded, survival rates calculated. Accurate documentation allows prediction of future yields and identification of superior breeding lines. His manual treated pregnancy complications with the same detachment. Difficult births that damaged breeding capacity meant immediate sale or reassignment. He provided mathematical formulas for determining when a female's breeding value fell below maintenance costs. Estate owners across the empire implemented his systems. They built underground breeding facilities to his specifications. They hired overseers trained in his methods. They kept the detailed records he recommended. Human reproduction became another branch of agricultural science. Varro's influence extended beyond private estates. Public breeding facilities followed his guidelines. Military suppliers used his ratios to ensure steady production of future soldiers. Even temples that needed virgin priestesses consulted his work on selective breeding for specific traits. The manual survived because it worked. Estates that followed Varro's methods reported higher yields, lower mortality, more predictable profits. His systematic approach replaced haphazard breeding with scientific precision. Rome's economy grew dependent on the efficiency he created. But efficiency required something else, something Varro only hinted at in his careful prose. New breeding stock requires adjustment. He wrote near the manual's end. Wild-caught females resist initial breeding attempts. Established protocols exist for encouraging compliance. He didn't elaborate on those protocols. He didn't need to. Every estate owner understood. Varro's manual gave the theory. Villa owners across the empire had already perfected the practice, starting with a process they called domestication. The cells were just big enough to lie down in. No windows. Stone walls that ate sound. For 6 months to a year, new female slaves would see no one, except their trainer. The archaeological evidence tells the story. Villa foundations across Italy show the same pattern. Underground chambers, always underground, 3 feet by 6 feet. Stone walls 2 feet thick. No light except what filtered through the feeding slot. The scratching of rats in the darkness. The drip of water somewhere beyond reach. They called it the domestication phase. Estate managers had perfected the process over generations. Take a woman fresh from the slave markets, strip away her name, her language, her connections to any life before, lock her in stone darkness. The only human contact came through one person, the trainer, male, always male, selected for specific qualities that estate records describe in disturbing detail. Patient men, quiet men, men who understood that breaking a human mind required the same methodical approach as training a horse. They kept journals. Some survived in villa ruins, wrapped in oilcloth, preserved by accident. The entries read like livestock management guides. Day 1. Subject shows expected resistance. No food until compliance with basic commands. Day 7. Subject attempted self-harm. Restraints applied. Day 14. First signs of dependence forming. Responded to trainer's voice. Accepted food from hand. The trainers had learned exactly how long it took to break different types of women. Young girls from rural areas broke fastest. 3 to 4 months of isolation and they would cling to their trainer like a savior. Women who'd known freedom took longer. 6 months, sometimes 8. Former prostitutes proved most resistant. They'd already learned to separate mind from body. The trainers had special methods for them. But isolation was just the first phase. The feeding ritual came next. No food except from the trainer's hand. No water except what he provided. Complete dependence for survival. The women learned to listen for footsteps in the corridor, to recognize the particular scrape of their trainer's sandals on stone. That sound meant food, water, brief respite from the pressing darkness. The trainers used calculated kindness, a soft word after days of silence, a gentle touch after weeks of nothing. The women's minds, starved of any human contact, latched onto these crumbs of humanity. Stockholm Syndrome perfected centuries before psychologists would name it. Villa records show the progression. Month 1, establish dependence. Month 2, introduce rewards for compliance. Month 3, begin basic conditioning. The trainers taught specific responses. How to stand when men entered. Where to keep their eyes. The proper posture of submission. Like teaching tricks to dogs, but with human beings who once had names and families and dreams. The successful trainers earned premium wages. Estate owners competed for those with the highest success rates. One trainer named Quintus left records of domesticating over 200 women across 3 decades. His methods became standard practice. His journal survives in fragments, matter-of-fact entries about breaking human spirits. Subject 7.3 responds well to evening visits. Established routine creates anticipation. Subject 8.1 required extended isolation. Now shows appropriate gratitude for basic provisions. Subject 8.7 terminated. Resistance exceeded profitable investment period. What they did with resistant cases became a warning to others. The punishment cells were smaller. No room to lie down. No feeding slot. Women who fought back, who refused to break, who maintained their defiance past the profitable period, they disappeared into these spaces. Other women in nearby cells heard the screams at first, then silence, then nothing. The trainer would mention it casually. Your neighbor couldn't learn. Such a waste. The domestication process had specific goals, not just obedience but eager compliance. The women needed to see their captivity as safety, their trainer as protector. They had to internalize their own worthlessness except as breeding stock. Most importantly, they had to transfer this trained submission to whoever owned them next. Estate sales records show domesticated women commanded higher prices. Buyers paid premiums for females who'd completed the full conditioning program. The certificates of domestication became standard documentation, like provenance for artwork, but for human beings trained to accept their fate. The trainers developed specialized techniques for different purposes. Women destined for breeding facilities received specific conditioning. They learned to present themselves for inspection, to show no emotion during intimate examinations, to accept repeated pregnancies as their natural purpose. The training removed any concept of consent, any notion of personal boundaries, any hope of different futures. Archaeological evidence reveals the brutal efficiency. Wear patterns on cell floors show where women paced in circles. Scratch marks on walls chart the days, then stop abruptly when hope died. Feeding slots worn smooth by thousands of desperate hands reaching for whatever the trainer offered. Some facilities specialized in particular types of domestication. One villa near Naples focused on young girls from Germanic tribes. The trainers there developed methods for overcoming language barriers. They used repetition, physical conditioning, careful manipulation of food and comfort. By the time these girls emerged from isolation, they spoke basic Latin and responded to commands without thinking. The investment paid off handsomely. A wild-caught woman fresh from slave markets might resist breeding, might kill infants, might attempt escape. A properly domesticated female accepted her role. She submitted to breeding schedules. She surrendered infants without struggle. She taught her daughters that this was simply how the world worked. But the domestication process achieved something even more valuable than compliance. It created women who would train the next generation. Mothers who told their daughters to submit. Who taught them the proper responses? Who passed down the conditioning like inherited trauma? The system perpetuated itself through broken spirits, teaching broken spirits. The trainers understood this multiplier effect. They selected certain women for extended conditioning. These became the trustees in breeding facilities, the ones who managed newer arrivals. who demonstrated proper behavior, who enforced the rules they'd been taught to embrace. Former victims became instruments of the system that destroyed them. Medical evidence from skeletal remains confirms the physical toll. Bone density loss from extended darkness, malnutrition markers from controlled feeding, stress fractures in feet from pacing on stone. The domestication process left signatures in calcium and marrow that archaeologists can read 2,000 years later. The process worked with horrifying consistency. Estate records show 90% success rates for young women, 80% for mature females, only 60% for women over 25, which is why older women rarely entered the program. The economics dictated everything. 6 months of trainer wages and food had to show profit. Some women found ways to resist even after domestication. They went through the motions but kept some spark hidden. These were the dangerous ones, the ones who might whisper rebellion to their children, who might remember they were human. The trainers had methods for identifying them, tests designed to reveal any remaining defiance. Those who failed disappeared into the punishment cells. The domestication process worked best on women who arrived alone, but for mothers who came with children, the Romans had developed an even more effective method of ensuring total compliance. The screaming would last for days, mothers clawing at stone walls, begging for children they'd never see again. Roman efficiency had weaponized the strongest force in human nature, maternal love. The separation happened immediately after birth. No warning, no preparation. The mother still bleeding, still reaching for the infant she'd carried 9 months. Guards would enter the cell, 2 holding her down while a 3rd took the baby. The women fought with animal desperation, bit, scratched, screamed until their throats went raw. Estate records document the process with bureaucratic precision. Infant removed at dawn, mother subdued. Normal resistance period, expected 72 to 96 hours. As if grief could be scheduled. As if a mother's anguish followed predictable timelines. But the Romans had studied this too. They'd learned that complete separation broke too many women. Suicide rates spiked. Breeding productivity plummeted. Dead women generated no profit. So they refined the system. Calculated cruelty that kept mothers functional but compliant. The innovation was scheduled glimpses. Once a month, sometimes less, guards would bring children past the cells, close enough for mothers to see, too far to touch. The women would press against bars, calling names their children didn't know, reaching through gaps barely wide enough for their wrists. The children, raised in separate facilities, stared at these desperate strangers without recognition. One preserved tablet from a villa near Capua outlined the precise protocol: display offspring at 30-day intervals, duration not to exceed 50 heartbeats, maintain distance of 10 paces, document maternal response for breeding records, 50 heartbeats to see your child, 10 paces of space that might as well be an ocean. Some mothers counted the days between visits, scratched marks on cell walls, 28, 29, 30, then footsteps in the corridor, the jangle of keys, hearts hammering as they waited to see which children the guards brought. The administrators took notes on which separation methods caused the fastest compliance. Total isolation from offspring created martyrs, women who starved themselves or found ways to end pregnancies. But these calculated glimpses, they created hope, and hope made manageable slaves, mothers who would do anything, endure anything, submit to anything, for the chance of one more glimpse. The overseers documented behavioral changes. Subject 258 showed increased cooperation after viewing offspring. Accepted breeding schedule without resistance. Subject 312 became violent when offspring was not presented during scheduled viewing. Recommend consistent display schedule for optimal management. They'd turn maternal love into a control mechanism. Some mothers tried to communicate during those 50 heartbeats. Whispered names, sang fragments of lullabies, made gestures that meant nothing to children raised by wet nurses who were ordered never to show affection. The guards noted which women attempted contact. These troublemakers found their viewing privileges suspended. Another calculation, another lever. The children lived in adjoining facilities, close enough that mothers sometimes heard crying through stone walls, a particular wail that sounded familiar. a laugh that might belong to their daughter. Their minds created connections that probably weren't real. Every sound became their child. Every distant voice carried possibility. But some mothers found ways to resist even this. They organized in whispers, created networks of information through the breeding facilities. Which guard could be bribed for news? Which wet nurse might carry a message? They used the laundry women, the food carriers, anyone who moved between sections. Tiny rebellions that kept humanity alive. One account describes a mother who convinced a guard to bring her son closer. Just once, close enough to touch. She grabbed his hand through the bars and pressed something into his palm. A small stone she'd polished smooth with her fingers. The guard yanked the child away, but the damage was done. The boy kept that stone, though he never knew why it mattered. Years later, that boy would join Spartacus. The systematic separation served multiple purposes. Beyond creating compliant mothers, it produced children who knew no other life. These facility-born slaves, raised in groups, taught only submission, became the most valuable products. They had no memories of freedom to poison their minds, no stories of different lives, no homeland to dream about. The children learned hierarchy from birth. Older slaves who'd proven their loyalty managed the nurseries. They taught proper responses before the children could properly walk, how to stand when Romans entered, where to keep their eyes. The posture of servitude became muscle memory by age 5. But the separation system's greatest cruelty was its exceptions. Certain women, those who showed exceptional breeding productivity, might earn extended viewings, 200 heartbeats instead of 50, 5 paces instead of 10. The possibility of privilege drove women to compete, to inform on those planning resistance, to police each other's behavior. The Romans had created a system where mothers enforced their own oppression for scraps of access to their children. The records show careful tracking, which rewards produced which behaviors, how to balance hope and despair for maximum output. One overseer in southern Italy developed a point system. Compliance earned credits. Successful pregnancies added more. Enough credits might purchase an actual moment of contact, a brief embrace, the chance to speak their child's name. Women hoarded these credits like treasure, accepted additional breeding, volunteered for the worst assignments, informed on escape attempts, anything to earn one more moment. The administrators noted the increased productivity, the reduced resistance, the way women policed themselves when children became currency. The wet nurses occupied a strange position in this system. Often older women past breeding age, they raised the facility-born children in dormitories. No affection allowed, no individual connections. They taught groups of 20 or 30 children simultaneously. Basic skills, proper responses, the rules of survival in a world that saw them as inventory. Some wet nurses found small ways to preserve humanity. A gentle touch while teaching. Stories disguised as lessons. Names whispered when guards couldn't hear. They became the only mothers these children knew, even as the system forbade any real connection. The children grew up seeing their birth mothers as strangers who cried behind bars, desperate women who called names that meant nothing. The separation was so complete that when facility-born slaves were sold, they showed no emotion, no recognition that somewhere in those cells, a woman had clawed stone walls bloody trying to reach them. Estate sales documents listed these children separately. Vernay stock, facility-born, the most expensive slaves on the market. Buyers paid premiums for humans who'd never known anything but slavery, who had no inconvenient memories, no problematic attachments, perfect products of a perfect system. But perfection required maintenance. The children who showed too much spirit disappeared. Those who asked questions vanished. The selection process started early. By age 7, overseers could identify which children would become problems. These were quietly removed, sold to distant mines, disappeared into gladiator schools, eliminated before they could contaminate others. The survivors learned the lesson. Don't stand out. Don't question. Don't feel. Become what they expected. Survive by surrendering everything internal. The facilities produced humans who'd forgotten they were human, who saw their own condition as natural, who would raise the next generation to accept the same fate. What happened to these separated children was carefully planned. They'd become test subjects for Rome's most ambitious experiment in human engineering, and they had a special name for it. These stolen children wouldn't disappear. They'd become part of Rome's most ambitious experiment in human engineering, the Vernae program. The Vernae, Rome's word for humans who'd never known they were human. Imagine being born into slavery so complete you didn't even have words for freedom. That's what Rome tried to create with the Vernae slaves bred and programmed from birth to accept servitude as natural as breathing. The agricultural manuals recommended it. 80% Vernae for optimal villa efficiency, 20% regular slaves to handle the dangerous work, the perfect ratio for a self-sustaining operation. Humans who'd police themselves, who'd train their own replacements, who'd never dream of anything beyond the walls they were born behind. The compound nurseries started before dawn. 30 infants per room, 5 caretakers rotating shifts. No individual attention, no names, just numbers chalked on wooden boards above each cot. The crying blended into white noise. Babies learned early that tears brought nothing. Rome had industrialized child-rearing the same way they'd industrialized breeding. The caretakers followed strict protocols. Pick up infants only for feeding. No eye contact during nursing, no singing, no rocking. Touch served function, never comfort. The women who broke these rules found themselves reassigned to field work, or worse. One preserved tablet from a villa near Herculaneum lists the daily schedule. First feeding at 4th hour, changing at 6th, second feeding at 8th. Sleep training began at 1 month. Infants who cried too long were moved to isolation chambers until they learned silence. By 6 months, the selection process began. Overseers watched for signs. Which babies showed too much spirit? Which ones fought for food? Which ones cried when others were hurt? These traits marked future troublemakers. The aggressive ones went to gladiator schools. The empathetic ones disappeared entirely. Only the compliant remained. The nursery workers followed strict protocols about what concepts to never mention: freedom, choice, family, hope, parents, home. The children grew up without words for things that might make them question their world. Language itself became a cage. How do you dream of freedom when you don't know the word exists? The Vernae learned a special vocabulary instead. Domine for master, Gratia for the mercy of being allowed to live, Beneficium for the privilege of serving. They absorbed these concepts with their first solid food. Gratitude for chains, joy in submission, pride in perfect obedience. At age 3, gender separation began. Boys to one compound, girls to another. No explanation. Children who'd slept side by side suddenly vanished from each other's lives. Those who asked questions learned not to. Those who cried for missing friends found themselves in the quiet rooms until the crying stopped. The training intensified with each year. Age 4 brought posture lessons. How to stand when Romans entered. The proper angle of a bowed head. The correct placement of hands. Children practiced for hours until muscle memory replaced thought. A freeborn Roman could identify Vernae slaves instantly by their unconscious submission poses. Age 5 introduced specialization. Overseers tested aptitudes. Strong boys began carrying loads. Dexterous girls learned spinning. Quick minds went to accounting rooms. Beautiful children entered separate programs with their own disturbing curricula. By age 5, Vernae children showed disturbing psychological patterns. They competed to show submission, informed on each other for tiny infractions, punished themselves for imperfect service. The overseers noted how they'd internalized the system completely. External discipline became unnecessary. The children enforced rules stricter than any Roman imposed. One account describes Vernae children beating another child who'd looked directly at a visiting senator. No adult ordered it. They simply knew. The violation of protocol triggered collective punishment. They'd learned to police boundaries they'd never been explicitly taught. The educational program avoided anything that might spark imagination. No stories of heroes. No tales of distant lands. No history before their birth in the compounds. They learned practical skills through repetition. Numbers for inventory. Letters for recording orders. Never poetry, never philosophy, never questions. Religious instruction focused on duty. The gods favored obedience. Jupiter blessed faithful service. Minerva rewarded perfect compliance. They learned prayers that thanked the masters for allowing them to exist. Sacred festivals became celebrations of their own enslavement. But nature has ways of breaking through programming. Sometimes a child would stop mid-task, staring at birds flying over compound walls. Sometimes two Vernae would lock eyes and recognize something human in each other. Sometimes dreams came unbidden, full of concepts they had no words to name. The overseers had protocols for these moments too. Re-education started with isolation, days in darkness to reset corrupted thinking, then intensive conditioning, repetitive tasks until the mind numbed, physical exhaustion until consciousness narrowed to mere survival. They broke down any emerging self and rebuilt it to specifications. Most Vernae never required re-education. The system worked with horrifying efficiency. By age 10, they moved to adult work assignments without transition trauma. They'd never known childhood as freeborn Romans understood it. Work was life, service was breath, submission was identity. Estate records praised the program's success. Vernae slaves showed lower escape attempts, higher productivity, better health outcomes. They ate when told, slept when ordered, bred when scheduled, died without disrupting operations. The perfect human machinery. But sometimes, despite everything, nature fought back. A Vernae girl might hide food for another. A boy might whisper a name he'd given himself in darkness. Small rebellions that meant nothing to Romans but everything to the children who risked them. Humanity, sprouting through cracks in the programming, like weeds through stone. The overseers documented these anomalies. Subject shows excessive attachment to cohort member. Subject created unauthorized markings on sleeping quarters. Subject exhibited protective behavior toward younger Vernae. Each notation marked a child for closer observation or removal. Some Vernae found ways to preserve fragments of identity. A special way of braiding hair that meant something only to them. A private gesture that felt like defiance. A made-up song hummed too quietly for guards to hear. Tiny acts of self-creation in a world designed to erase selfhood. The wet nurses occupied a complex position. Often Vernae themselves, raised in the same system, they perpetuated what they'd learned. But occasionally, one would risk everything to show kindness. A gentle touch while teaching. A soft word during illness. These moments of humanity became treasures children carried into adulthood. Sexual training began at puberty. Matter-of-fact lessons in submission. Vernae learned to disassociate from their bodies completely, to perform without feeling, to breed without attachment. The girls who showed emotional responses underwent additional conditioning. The boys who displayed protective instincts disappeared. By 14, Vernae were finished products. Humans who thought like property, who moved like owned objects, who breathed submission with every lungful of air. They entered the general slave population as models of perfect servitude, examples for wild-caught slaves to emulate. But the program's greatest success was reproductive. Vernae women accepted breeding schedules without question, surrendered infants without struggle, returned to work without mourning. They'd learned from birth that their bodies were tools for producing more tools. The cycle perpetuated itself through generations of programmed compliance. Vernae men showed equal conditioning. They performed breeding duties on schedule, showed no attachment to offspring, accepted reassignment without protest. The natural bonds between parents and children had been severed so completely they didn't know such bonds should exist. Estate owners paid premium prices for Vernae stock. A properly programmed Vernae cost 3 times more than a wild-caught slave but proved worth the investment. No adjustment period, no training required, no risk of rebellion, just immediate, perfect function. The multi-generational vision was working. Each cohort of Vernae produced an even more compliant generation. Mothers who'd never known motherhood raised children who'd never known childhood. The system refined itself through human generations like selective breeding in livestock. Some estates boasted third-generation Vernae, humans whose grandparents had been born in compounds, who carried no genetic memory of freedom, whose bloodlines had been scrubbed of resistance as thoroughly as their minds had been cleaned of hope. But genetic memory runs deeper than Rome understood. Sometimes, a third-generation Vernae would wake screaming from dreams of open skies they'd never seen. Sometimes, a child born in deepest captivity would claw at walls with an urgency that came from somewhere beyond learning. Sometimes, ancestral memory broke through in ways that terrified overseers who thought they'd perfected control. The Romans documented these failures carefully. Bloodlines that showed persistent resistance despite generations of conditioning. Family groups that produced too many anomalies. Genetic lines that refused to break. These were culled from the breeding program. Entire family trees ended because somewhere in the blood, freedom remembered itself. The Vernae program left traces, not in documents, but in bones. Modern archaeologists keep finding skeletons that tell stories Rome never wanted preserved. The bones don't lie. 2,000 years later, they're still telling their stories in calcium and trauma. The archaeologist's brush whispered across the pelvis of female skeleton 47. Villa excavation, southern Italy, 2018. The bone told its story in deformities. Pelvic inlet narrowed from too early pregnancy. Stress fractures that never properly healed. She'd given birth before her own bones finished growing. The preservation was remarkable. Volcanic ash from Vesuvius had sealed entire villa complexes like time capsules. Not just buildings, bodies. Hundreds of them in the slave quarters. The excavation team kept finding more. Dr. Sarah Chen measured the pelvic scarring with calipers, the scratching of pencil on notebook as she recorded dimensions. This skeleton showed first pregnancy markers at age 13, maybe 14. The bones had tried to adapt, warping into shapes that let undersized girls deliver full-term infants. Evolution takes millennia. These girls had months. The damage patterns repeated across every breeding facility they excavated. Young female skeletons with pelvises that looked like teaching specimens for traumatic childbirth. Spines compressed from carrying pregnancies on frames too small. Malnutrition markers in the teeth, calcium stripped from their own bones to build their babies. The body eating itself to fulfill its forced purpose. Skeleton 47 had companions, 48 through 73, all showing the same damage patterns, all buried in the same ash layer, all between 13 and 25 years old. A breeding facility's worth of evidence, frozen at the moment Vesuvius ended their suffering. But the bones revealed more than just pregnancy trauma. The isotope analysis came back from the lab. These women had eaten different food than the villa's other slaves. Less protein, more grains. The exact diet Varro's manual recommended for breeding stock. Enough nutrition to maintain fertility, not enough to waste expensive resources. The chemistry of their bones proved they'd lived their entire short lives on starvation's edge. Compare these to free Roman women's remains from the same period. Women who chose when to have children, who ate adequate food, who gave birth with midwives attending. Their pelvises showed normal wear. Their bones told stories of lives lived, not bodies consumed. The archaeologists found something else in the breeding quarters. Smaller skeletons. Infants who never made it past their first breath. The tiny bones clustered in specific areas, not scattered randomly but placed with purpose. Someone had been keeping track, recording. The archaeological team mapped each fragment, reconstructed the original burial patterns. 137 infant skeletons in a single villa's disposal pit. The preservation let researchers determine causes of death. Malformation from mothers too young, nutritional deficiencies from starved pregnancies, birth trauma from pelvises that couldn't properly dilate. These weren't natural infant mortality rates. This was the cost of treating human reproduction like an industrial process. The teeth told their own stories. Enamel hypoplasia, those horizontal lines that form when children face severe stress. Every skeleton showed them. Multiple lines. These children had survived crisis after crisis before their bodies finally gave out. The ones who lived past infancy carried these marks into adulthood, permanent records of childhood spent fighting to exist. But the excavation's most disturbing discovery wasn't in the main villa. The ground-penetrating radar had shown anomalies behind the breeding complex. Regular depressions in neat rows. too organized to be natural, too consistent to be random burials. The team carefully excavated the first depression, then stopped, called in specialists. What they'd found required different expertise. Mass graves, but organized mass graves, sorted by size. The smallest skeletons on the left, newborns who'd lived hours or days. Next, infants who'd survived weeks or months. Then toddlers, each grave carefully segregated by age. Someone had maintained this system for decades, filing dead children by development stage, like inventory reports. The forensic anthropologists could read the patterns. This grave held females only, the rejected breeding stock from failed domestication. That section contained males who'd shown defects. Another area just for twins, which Romans considered unlucky. Death itself had been administratively categorized. The soil chemistry showed something else. Quicklime. They'd used quicklime to speed decomposition, to control disease, to make room for the next batch. Industrial efficiency applied to dead children. The archaeological team found purchasing records in the villa's archives, monthly quicklime orders, the same ledgers that tracked grain and wine. Dr. Chen's team made molds of the pelvic damage, 3D printed models for teaching. Modern medical students studied them, horrified. These weren't historical curiosities. They were evidence, proof of systematic torture through forced pregnancy. The bones screamed accusations across 2 millennia. The male skeletons told different stories. Gladiators with their characteristic wounds, field slaves with repetitive stress injuries. But in the breeding facilities, they found males with unusual patterns. No signs of hard labor, well fed compared to other slaves. These were the breeding males Varro had described, kept healthy for one purpose. Their bones showed different damage. Healed fractures from controlling resistant women, bite marks on finger bones, defensive wounds on forearms. Whatever happened in those breeding cells had involved violence on all sides. The clinical language of agricultural manuals hadn't captured the reality of forced mating. Modern DNA analysis revealed more horrors. The infant graves contained siblings, half-siblings, children who shared fathers but had different mothers. The breeding programs had used the same males across multiple women, exactly as Varro recommended. One male skeleton's DNA appeared in dozens of infant remains. A single man forced to father an entire generation of slaves. The maternal DNA told its own story. Women bred repeatedly with different males. Genetic diversity maintained for stronger offspring. The Romans had understood practical genetics centuries before science named it. They'd applied livestock principles to human beings with mathematical precision. But sometimes, the bones revealed resistance. Skeleton 92 had knife marks on her finger bones. Defensive wounds. She'd fought back during a breeding attempt. Skeleton 107 showed healed breaks in both hands. The pattern suggested repeated resistance, repeated punishment. These women had fought even when fighting meant broken bones. The archaeologists found other evidence of defiance. A female skeleton buried with a tiny carved figure hidden in her hand. A child skeleton wearing a bracelet made of human hair, perhaps their mother's last gift. Small acts of humanity, preserved in calcium and grief. The volcanic ash had preserved soft tissue in some cases. Stomach contents revealed last meals. The breeding women had eaten different food the day Vesuvius erupted. Better food, richer food. The villa owners had been trying to boost fertility, investing in their stock right up to the moment the mountain exploded. One perfectly preserved room showed the moment of death. 3 pregnant women in cells, a male overseer in the corridor. The position suggested he'd been making rounds when the pyroclastic flow hit, checking on investments, recording breeding status, buried while maintaining the system that enslaved them all. The bones kept revealing patterns. Arthritis in teenagers from calcium depletion, spinal damage in 20-year-olds from continuous pregnancy, dental disease from poor nutrition. These women aged in dog years. 7 years of breeding aged their skeletons like 40 years of normal life. Modern medical technology let researchers reconstruct faces. Skeleton 47 became a person, 13 years old when first pregnant, dead by 20, Her reconstructed face looked like any teenager, except for the eyes. The reconstruction couldn't capture what those eyes had seen. The evidence mounted with each excavation, every villa with breeding facilities showed the same patterns, the same mass graves, the same sorted infant burials, the same destroyed young female bodies. This wasn't one cruel estate owner. This was systematic, industrial, empire-wide. But the most damning evidence came from comparing sites. Breeding facilities from Britain to Syria showed identical layouts, the same cell dimensions, the same burial patterns, the same bone damage. Romans had standardized human reproduction like they'd standardized roads. An empire built on architectural precision had applied that same precision to breaking women's bodies. The academic papers used careful language: forced pregnancy, systematic sexual violence, reproductive coercion. But the bones spoke plainer truths: torture, rape, murder. The foundations of empire built on millions of destroyed women and dead children. Dr. Chen published her findings in leading journals. Museums displayed the evidence. The pelvic casts became teaching tools. 2,000 years after these women died, their bones finally testified. Their calcium and phosphorus became witness statements. Their deformed skeletons proved what Roman texts had hidden in agricultural metaphors. But for every skeleton found, thousands more dissolved into Italian soil. No markers, no names, no record except in the prosperity they'd been forced to create. The missing bones haunt archaeology. How many breeding facilities haven't been found? How many mass graves lie under modern Italian towns? The DNA evidence suggests millions. Genetic markers in modern populations trace back to these breeding programs. Somewhere in Mediterranean bloodlines, the echoes persist. Children of children of children who began in those cells. Humanity's family tree twisted by industrial slavery. The bones keep emerging. Every construction project in Italy risks uncovering more. More breeding cells, more infant graves, more evidence of Rome's systematic atrocities. The archaeologists document each discovery, catalogue each skeleton, give numbers to the nameless. But one haunting detail appears again and again: the position of the bodies. In breeding facilities across the empire, young female skeletons lie in the same position, curled on their left sides, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around their bellies, the universal position of pregnant women trying to protect unborn children as death arrived. They died as they'd lived, pregnant, frightened, holding on to the only thing that was theirs. Even as Vesuvius burned or soldiers slaughtered or disease claimed them, they curved their spines around their wombs. The bones froze them in that final gesture: protection that couldn't protect, love that couldn't save. The archaeologists photograph each skeleton before removal, document the positions, note the gestures. These images join thousands of others in databases, digital graveyards where the bones can finally rest, where their stories compound into undeniable evidence. 2,000 years later, ground-penetrating radar keeps finding more. Under parking lots, beneath vineyards, below modern villas built atop ancient foundations, the bones wait, patient as geology, ready to testify when the living finally listen. But bones and ash weren't the only evidence. Across the Italian countryside, archaeologists kept finding something else. Something that revealed the true scale of horror. Because for every female skeleton showing pregnancy damage, archaeologists were finding something else. Mass graves filled with tiny bones. The construction crew thought they'd hit an ancient trash pit. Then the archaeologist arrived and went pale. Those weren't pottery shards. They were infant bones. Hundreds of them. The excavator's teeth scraped against something that shouldn't have been there. Work stopped. The operator climbed down from his cab, boots crunching on disturbed earth. What he saw made him call for the site supervisor. What the supervisor saw made him call the police. What the police saw made them call archaeologists. Dr. Maria Rossi arrived within the hour. 20 years excavating Roman sites, but her hands shook as she knelt by the pit. The tiny skulls nested together like eggs. Femurs no longer than her thumb. Rib cages that could fit in her palm. This wasn't a cemetery. Cemeteries had order, rituals, care. This was disposal. The team worked in silence. Brushes whispered across bone. Cameras clicked documentation. Every fragment catalogued. Every position mapped. The infants had been thrown in. Not placed. Not buried. Thrown. Some skulls showed impact fractures from hitting earlier bodies. By noon they'd counted 50. By evening, 100. The pit kept going deeper. The bones told their ages through development. Newborns with fontanelles still open. Week-old infants with barely fused craniums. Some had lived months. The wear on their teeth showed they'd been fed, kept alive just long enough. For what? Why feed infants you plan to discard? Dr. Rossi found the answer in the demographic patterns. The age distribution of the skeletons revealed something horrifying. Clusters at specific developmental stages. Newborn to 7 days, the highest numbers. Then another spike at 1 month. Another at 3 months. These weren't random deaths. Someone had been selecting, sorting, deciding who lived and who went into the pit. The gender ratio made her stop breathing. 70% female. She cross-referenced with Varro's manual, still open on her laptop. Female offspring may be retained if breeding stock requires replenishment. Otherwise, early termination prevents resource waste. The clinical language described what her brush was uncovering. Selective infanticide. Girls thrown away because the facility had enough future breeders. But some villas had even more systematic disposal methods. The ground-penetrating radar revealed structures beneath the pit. Stone channels, drainage systems. The team excavated carefully. What they found had been built for efficiency. Channels that led from the breeding quarters directly to disposal areas. No need to carry bodies. Just slide them down. Industrial waste management for discarded infants. One channel showed particular wear. Smooth grooves worn by repeated use. How many tiny bodies had slid down this stone? The archaeologist doing the excavation vomited, then returned to work. Someone had to document this. Someone had to count. The preservation varied by depth. Upper layers showed more damage. Lower layers, protected by soil compression, revealed details. Tiny finger bones still articulated. Milk teeth that never bit food. Some skeletons clutched objects. A wooden bead, a scrap of cloth. Things someone had placed with them. Small acts of humanity in mechanized horror. But the worst discovery came from the soil analysis. Layers. Distinct chronological layers like tree rings. The disposal pit had been used continuously for over a century. Generations of discarded infants. The soil between bone layers showed seasonal variations. Spring births, summer deaths, autumn deposits. They could track breeding seasons by when the pit filled fastest. Dr. Rossi's team found more pits at every breeding facility. Same patterns, same age distributions, same gender bias, same industrial efficiency. One villa near Naples had 7 pits. Carbon dating showed sequential use. When one filled, they started another. 100 years of throwing away children. The medical analysis revealed causes of death. Some showed no trauma. Exposure, probably. Left to die and disposed of when convenient. Others had crushed skulls, quick deaths. Efficient. The smaller skeletons, premature births, showed no intervention attempts. Born too early, into the pit. When they carbon dated the remains, the timeline showed systematic peaks. Economic downturns meant more dead infants. When grain prices rose, the pits filled faster. Market forces determining which babies lived. The archaeologist could track Roman recessions by counting tiny skeletons. Supply and demand, written in calcium and phosphorus. Some facilities had tried different methods. Cremation pits behind villas, infant-sized furnaces, but burning took fuel, cost money. The disposal pits were free. Just dig a hole. Fill it with discarded products. Cover when full. Start another. The economics of infanticide favored simple gravity. The archaeological evidence aligned with written sources they'd always misunderstood. References to exposure in Roman texts. Historians had imagined abandoned infants on hillsides. Maybe some survived. Maybe kind strangers rescued them. The pits told different truths. Exposure meant disposal sites. Industrial solutions for industrial breeding. But individual bones sometimes told individual stories. One skeleton, smaller than the rest, had been wrapped in expensive fabric. Traces of purple dye still clung to fragments. Purple meant wealth. Someone with access to luxury had wrapped this infant for disposal. A moment of grief in systematic murder, or just using available materials. Another pit contained an anomaly. Adult finger bones among the infants. Just a few, worn smooth. Someone had held them, carried them. A mother who'd kept some piece of her child. The archaeologists found no other adult remains. Just those few finger bones, treasured, hidden, finally reunited in the pit. The team developed protocols for these excavations. Counseling available on site. Mandatory breaks. Some archaeologists couldn't continue. Counting baby bones broke something in them. Others worked with grim determination. Someone had to witness. Someone had to count. Someone had to prove what Rome had done. International databases grew with each excavation. Italy, Spain, North Africa, Britannia, every province showing the same patterns, the same pits, the same age distributions, the same gender bias. Rome had exported its methods with its legions, built disposal sites alongside aqueducts. Modern technology revealed more than bones. Soil chemistry showed milk proteins. These infants had been nursing when they died. Stomach contents preserved in some cases showed last meals. Mother's milk hours before disposal. The biological evidence made the crime personal. These weren't abstract victims. They'd been warm, fed, held, then thrown away. The numbers kept climbing. One pit, 300 infants. Another, 450. A villa in Sicily, 700 in a single disposal site. Multiply by every breeding facility. By every decade of the empire. The mathematics of mass murder overwhelmed calculation. Dr. Rossi published initial findings. Media attention exploded. Tour groups wanted to see the death pits. Local governments wanted them covered. Academics demanded full excavation. The bones became political. 2,000 years dead, still causing controversy. But the excavations continued. Each pit mapped, each skeleton photographed, each tiny life documented. Digital reconstructions showed how the pits had filled. Time-lapse horror, a century compressed to minutes. Watching bones accumulate like snowfall, the disposal sites revealed Roman efficiency at its worst. No wasted space, no wasted effort, no wasted sentiment. Just the steady accumulation of discarded humans. The same engineering that built roads and aqueducts applied to throwing away infants. Infrastructure for infanticide. Some archaeologists started naming them. Not official protocol, but skeleton 273 became Anna, 389 became Marcus. Small rebellions against the numbers. Ways to stay sane while counting atrocities. The dead deserved more than catalogue entries. But for every skeleton recovered, dozens more dissolved into soil. Calcium leached away. Phosphorus absorbed by roots. Italian vineyards growing from ground enriched by infant bones. Wine pressed from grapes fed by ancient murders. The land itself complicit in forgetting. The pits kept yielding evidence. Seasonal variations showed breeding schedules. Depth analysis revealed policy changes. When disposal rates dropped, breeding had slowed. When they spiked, someone had ordered increased production. Market forces made visible in mass graves. Dr. Rossi's team found something else. Tool marks on some bones. Cuts, scrapes. Not random, not violence. Methodical marks. Someone had been studying these infants. Dissecting. Learning. Roman medical knowledge, advanced by practicing on discarded babies. Science, built on murder. The evidence mounted beyond denial. Every construction project risked uncovering more pits. Italian law required archaeological surveys before building. Ground-penetrating radar became standard. Developers budgeted for potential infant disposal site remediation. Modern bureaucracy acknowledging ancient horror. But the worst part wasn't the numbers, wasn't the efficiency, wasn't even the scale. It was the normality. These pits sat next to kitchens, under gardens, behind bathhouses. Daily life proceeding meters from where infants were thrown away. Romans eating dinner while babies decomposed nearby. Children playing above mass graves. The banality of systematic infanticide. The archaeological reports used careful language. Non-adult human remains, disposal contexts, demographic selectivity. But the photographs showed truth. Tiny skulls packed like cobblestones. Arm bones tangled like dropped sticks. The casual efficiency of mass murder made visible. Each excavation added evidence. Each pit told the same story. Each tiny skeleton witnessed to policies that treated humans as disposable products. The ground kept giving up its dead. Patient bones waiting 2 millennia to testify. But these mass graves were still being filled in 73 BCE, when Spartacus himself, a product of Roman slavery, decided to strike at the heart of the system. The rebels found them in rows, dozens of pregnant women chained in underground cells beneath the villa. The splintering of wood echoed through stone corridors as Spartacus's men broke down door after door. October night, 73 BCE. The smell hit them first: human waste, fear, something medical and sharp, then silence. Complete silence from warriors who'd survived the arena's worst horrors. 40 cells, 3 women per cell, all of them showing. The rebels stood frozen in the doorway, torches throwing shadows across faces they couldn't process. These weren't typical slave quarters. The walls were too thick, the chains too short. The women couldn't stand fully upright or lie down properly. Some looked barely 15. A Thracian gladiator dropped his sword. The clatter rang through the underground chamber like an accusation. Nobody moved to pick it up. The women stared back with eyes that expected nothing. No rescue, no mercy. Just another inspection, another calculation. One girl in the corner cell, she couldn't have been older than 14, pressed protective hands over her swollen belly. The chains rattled with the movement. Spartacus himself hadn't spoken since they'd broken through the first door. Now he moved between the cells, counting. His lieutenants watched their general's face change from confusion to recognition to something darker. They'd found stockpiles of weapons before. Gold, grain, never this. One of his men, a Gaul who'd fought beside him for months, turned and vomited against the wall. The sound echoed in the stone chamber. Still, Spartacus kept counting, walking the rows, taking in the feeding slots, the waste channels, the worn grooves in the floor where countless women had paced the limits of their chains. He understood before the others. This wasn't random cruelty. This was infrastructure. Free them, he said finally. His voice came out strange, hollow. Cut the chains. The men moved like sleepwalkers. Metal tools scraped against iron shackles. Some women cringed at the approaching rebels. Others didn't react at all. They'd learned that reaction brought pain. Better to be stone. Better to be nothing. As the chains fell away, one woman collapsed. Her legs, cramped from the short tethers, couldn't hold her weight. A rebel caught her before she hit the stone. She flinched from his touch, then went limp. Submission trained so deep it had become reflex. But Spartacus wasn't watching the women anymore. He'd found something else. Wax tablets stacked on an overseer's desk, breeding schedules, pairing charts, projected delivery dates. Female 4, 7-2, successful mounting, expect produce in 7 months. Female 4-7-3, third trimester, prepare for harvest. The same language the Romans used for wheat and grapes. His hand tightened on the tablets until the wax cracked. More men arrived from the upper villa. They'd secured the main house, killed the guards, freed the field slaves. Now they descended into this underground horror, their celebration dying as they saw what waited below. Veterans of the arena. Men who'd killed for sport. They looked like children discovering death for the first time. "General," one lieutenant whispered, "what is this place?" Spartacus held up the tablets. His men couldn't read, but they understood the charts, the columns of numbers, the mechanical precision of human husbandry. One man reached for his sword again, needing something solid to grip. The women began to emerge from cells, moving with the careful steps of people who'd learned that sudden movement brought punishment. Some headed instinctively for the feeding area. Others stood exactly where they'd been freed, waiting for orders. Agency beaten out of them so thoroughly they couldn't conceive of choosing their own actions. But then, something shifted. One woman, older than the rest, began to speak, quiet at first, then louder. She was naming the tablets, explaining the system. She'd been here longest, seen the most. Her words came in broken phrases, but the rebels understood. Forced breeding, scheduled matings, infants taken at birth. Some women here had produced 10, 12, 15 children, never held them, never named them, just produced and produced until their bodies gave out. A young gladiator turned and punched the stone wall. His knuckles split. Blood smeared the limestone. Nobody stopped him. Spartacus moved deeper into the facility. His torchlight revealed more chambers. The birthing room with its restraint table. The recovery cells where women waited for their bodies to heal enough for the next pregnancy. The examination area with its tools for checking breeding readiness. But it was the last room that made him stop breathing. Records. Years of them. Shelves of tablets and scrolls. Every birth documented. Every infant sorted. Every woman reduced to productivity metrics. This wasn't one villa's private cruelty. These records referenced other facilities. Standardized forms. Shared breeding stock between estates. An entire network exposed in wax and ink. He grabbed a torch from the wall. The flames danced across his face, reflecting something his men had never seen before. Not the rage of battle, not the defiance of rebellion. Something colder, more purposeful. "Burn it," he ordered. "Everything. The records first, then the building." His men hesitated. They'd come for gold and weapons. Burning buildings announced their presence, made tracking easier, but the look on their general's face allowed no argument. As men ran for oil and kindling, Spartacus turned back to the freed women. Some had found the food stores, were eating with mechanical efficiency. Others stood in groups, whispering. A few younger ones were crying, the first emotion they'd shown. "You're free," he told them. The words seemed to puzzle them. He tried again. "No more chains. No more." He gestured at the cells, at the charts, at the entire underground machine for grinding humans into commodity. Most stared without comprehension, but one girl, maybe 16, visibly pregnant, asked a question that made his chest tighten. "Where do we go?" He had no answer. His rebellion had 90,000 followers. Men, women, children, all fleeing Roman slavery. Adding pregnant women would slow them down, make them easier to track. His own people would question resources spent on those who couldn't fight or march quickly. But he looked at the girl's swollen belly, at her stick-thin arms, at the marks on her wrists from years of shackles. His decision came from somewhere deeper than strategy. "With us," he said. "You come with us." The fire started in the records room. Flames ate through decades of documentation. Birth records, breeding charts, productivity tables, all of it turning to ash and smoke. The fire spread to the wooden support beams. The ceiling groaned. "Everyone out." The rebels herded the women up the stairs. Some moved quickly, driven by the smoke. Others had to be carried, their muscles too atrophied for rapid movement. The strongest women helped the weakest. Small solidarities forming in the face of freedom they didn't understand. They emerged into cool night air. The main villa already blazed against the darkness, but Spartacus ordered the underground fire fed. More oil, more wood. He wanted those chambers so thoroughly destroyed that archaeology itself couldn't reconstruct them. As the breeding facility burned, something else happened. Field slaves from the villa began to recognize faces among the freed women. A sister sold years ago, a daughter taken at 14, a wife who'd disappeared into the villa's lower levels and never returned. Reunions erupted across the courtyard, families shattered by the breeding programs finding fragments of themselves. But for every reunion there were questions. Where were the children? The infants taken at birth? The toddlers sold to other estates? The women who'd been bred couldn't answer. They'd never known where their babies went. That ignorance had been another cruelty, another control. Spartacus watched it all, the joy and horror mixing in the firelight. His own past rose unbidden. Thrace, His wife. The life Rome had stolen when they made him a gladiator. He'd thought he understood slavery's worst cruelties. The arena had taught him about death as spectacle. This was worse. This was life itself, weaponized against the living. One of his lieutenants approached. A former gladiator from Capua. "General, the men are asking, do we hit more villas tonight? Press our advantage." Spartacus turned from the burning facility. The flames reflected in his eyes made him look like something Rome should fear. When he spoke, his voice carried over the crackle of fire. "Every villa from here to the mountains, but not for gold, not for weapons." He pointed at the rescued women, at their swollen bellies and broken bodies. "We find all of them. Every breeding facility, every woman locked underground. We free them all. And then? Then we burn the evidence of what Rome Island. We burn it so completely that they'll have to rebuild their economy without this." He searched for words that could encompass the horror. Found none. Without this. His men dispersed to spread the orders. Priority targets had changed. While other rebel groups raided for supplies, Spartacus's forces would seek out breeding facilities. The economic damage would be catastrophic. Every destroyed facility meant lost investments, lost future profits, lost systems that had taken generations to perfect. But more than economics drove him now. As the night wore on, more rebels returned with reports. 3 more facilities found and burning. 60 more women freed. Tales of underground chambers across the countryside. Some estates had multiple facilities, some specialized in particular types of breeding. The infrastructure was everywhere, hidden beneath ordinary villas, like tumors beneath skin. The freed women complicated everything. Many were too traumatized to travel quickly. Some were days from giving birth. Others had been so systematically broken they couldn't understand freedom as a concept. The rebellion would have to slow down, create support systems, tend to those whom Rome had reduced to less than human. Some rebels grumbled. This wasn't what they'd signed up for. They wanted to fight Romans, not play nursemaid to broken women. But when they saw the breeding facilities themselves, the grumbling stopped. When they found their own countrywomen in chains, their own people reduced to livestock, the grumbling turned to rage. By dawn, 7 facilities burned across the region. Hundreds of women freed, thousands of records destroyed, decades of breeding documentation turned to ash. Local magistrates woke to smoke on the horizon, and the news that Spartacus had changed tactics. He wasn't just freeing slaves anymore. He was systematically destroying the infrastructure of slavery itself. The Romans would notice the economic damage first: lost investments, disrupted breeding programs, the careful genetics of generations going up in smoke. But Spartacus understood something deeper. Every woman freed was a mother who wouldn't produce more slaves. Every burned facility was infrastructure that couldn't be easily rebuilt. Every destroyed record was bloodlines that couldn't be tracked. He was attacking Rome's future. As the sun rose over smoking ruins, Spartacus gathered his expanded force. 90,000 had become 93,000. The new additions couldn't fight. Many could barely walk. But they carried something more powerful than swords. They carried proof of what Rome really was. The strongest women began to tell their stories. Word spread through the camp. The gladiators who'd thought they'd seen slavery's worst face learned otherwise. The field slaves who'd envied house slaves discovered what happened in villa basements. The rebellion's purpose shifted with each testimony. This wasn't just about freedom anymore. This was about ending a system so monstrous that even hardened killers wept to learn of it. Spartacus made another decision that morning. The rebellion would keep 2 goals now: military victory when possible, but always, the systematic destruction of breeding facilities. Let Rome keep its gold, its art, its architecture, but the machinery for manufacturing humans, that would burn wherever they found it. His strange orders began to make sense to his followers. Find the breeding facilities, free the women, burn everything, especially the records. They understood now. The records were genealogies of atrocity, proof of systematic horror, evidence that Rome knew exactly what it was doing. More reports arrived. Local Romans were fleeing, but not with their usual treasures. They were evacuating breeding documentation. moving pregnant slaves to hidden locations. The empire was trying to protect its investment in human manufacturing. It wouldn't work. Spartacus had 90,000 people who now knew what to look for. Underground chambers, pregnant women hidden away, the architectural signatures of human breeding facilities. Every escaped slave became an intelligence asset. They knew which villas held secrets, which senators specialized in breeding, which trade routes moved human cargo. The rebellion had found its true purpose. Not just freedom for themselves, but the destruction of the system that created slavery. Physical demolition of breeding infrastructure, rescue of victims, elimination of records that tracked bloodlines like livestock pedigrees. The moment Crassus heard about the destroyed breeding facilities, he abandoned his villa. The richest man in Rome had one priority: stop Spartacus before he destroyed the foundation of the Roman economy. The war room erupted. Crassus's fist slammed against the marble table, sending wine cups clattering. His generals wanted to protect the gold mines, the silver reserves, the weapon stockpiles. They didn't understand. Forget the gold. His voice echoed off stone walls. If we lose the breeding facilities, we lose Rome's future. The scratching of stylus on wax as his secretary recorded every word. Around the table, Rome's military elite shifted uncomfortably. They'd fought Carthaginians, Germans, Greeks, never faced an enemy who targeted infrastructure instead of armies. Crassus spread the damage reports across the table. 7 facilities burned in one night, 300 breeding females lost, decades of bloodline documentation destroyed. The numbers made his jaw clench. Each woman represented 20 years of potential production. Each burned record meant carefully tracked genetics vanished forever. He's not stealing, Crassus explained to men who still didn't grasp the catastrophe. He's erasing. Every facility he burns is a generation of slaves we'll never produce. But Crassus's private letters revealed his real fear, not the immediate losses, the precedent. His correspondence with fellow estate owners exposed growing panic. If slaves learned about the breeding facilities, if they understood the systematic nature of their oppression, if they saw their mothers and daughters in those cells, the rebellion would become something else entirely, not just gladiators seeking freedom. Every slave in Italy with a personal vendetta. The emergency session of villa owners convened at midnight. Crassus's own estate heavily guarded. The wealthiest men in Rome gathered in his triclinium. They'd brought their own damage assessments. The conversations overlapped, voices rising, panic barely controlled. "My companion facility," Senator Lucullus said. 20 years of selective breeding, gone. The bloodlines I'd developed for intelligence, for specific skills. "You think that's bad?" Marcus Lentulus interrupted. "I lost 3 facilities. 3. Do you understand the investment, the future profits?" Crassus let them vent. Then he stood. The room quieted. When the richest man in Rome spoke, even senators listened. "Gentlemen, this isn't about individual losses." He gestured to his secretary, who unrolled a map of Italy. Red marks showed destroyed facilities. Black marks showed intact ones. The pattern was clear. Spartacus was moving systematically. He's targeting the entire system. The implications settled over the room like funeral shrouds. These facilities weren't just profitable. They were essential. Rome consumed slaves at horrific rates. The mines alone devoured thousands yearly. Without breeding programs, they'd depend entirely on war captives. Unreliable, expensive, insufficient for the empire's appetite. "It's a national security issue," Crassus continued. "Without our breeding infrastructure, Rome's economy collapses within a generation." The Senate initially refused to understand the threat. Senators who'd never managed estates directly couldn't grasp the economics. Crassus presented the projections. His accountants had worked through the night. Charts showed slave population curves. Without breeding facilities, relying only on capture and trade, the numbers plummeted. 20% decline in 5 years, 40% in 10. By 20 years, total economic collapse. "The gladiator is attacking our future," Crassus explained to increasingly pale faces. "Every woman he frees is 20 slaves we'll never have. Every facility he burns is infrastructure we'll need years to rebuild." Every record he destroys is bloodline documentation we can't recover. But the records showed something else. Something that made even Crassus pause. Spartacus wasn't random. He knew exactly which villas to target, which underground chambers to seek. Someone was feeding him intelligence. Someone who understood the breeding network intimately. "We have a leak," Crassus announced. "Someone with access to our shipping records, our breeding schedules, our facility locations." The room erupted again. Accusations flew. Everyone suspected everyone. These men had built fortunes on human misery. Trust came hard when profit was involved. But Crassus had already identified the source. The freed women themselves. They'd lived in the facilities. They knew the networks, the transfer patterns, which estates specialized in what type of breeding. They were guiding Spartacus to every hidden chamber in Italy. The military redeployment began immediately. Crassus convinced the Senate to grant him extraordinary powers, not to chase Spartacus directly, not yet. First, protect the remaining facilities. Legions dispatched to guard breeding centers. Naval vessels positioned to protect slave ships. The entire Roman military reorganized around protecting human production infrastructure. 8 legions, Crassus ordered his generals. 2,000 men per major facility. Fortify them like frontier forts. Anyone approaching without authorization dies. His commanders exchanged glances. 8 legions to guard pregnant women in cellars? It seemed excessive. Until Crassus showed them the economic projections again. Those women in cellars were worth more than gold mines. Their wombs generated more wealth than quarries. But Crassus had underestimated how much Spartacus knew. The gladiator had something more valuable than military intelligence. He had women who'd lived in those facilities for decades, who knew every hidden entrance, every guard rotation, every weakness in supposedly impregnable defenses. They drew maps in dirt, explained schedules, revealed which overseers took bribes, which guards drank on duty, which walls had maintenance tunnels. The first fortified facility fell within a week. Crassus received the report at dawn, legions stationed outside, guards at every entrance. Somehow Spartacus had gotten inside anyway. Through maintenance passages the architects had forgotten to document. The facility burned from the inside out. 300 women freed, records destroyed, 2,000 legionaries standing uselessly outside while smoke poured from ventilation shafts. The tactical response evolved. Crassus ordered guards inside the facilities, in the breeding chambers themselves, Roman soldiers standing watch over pregnant women in chains. The imagery was so disturbing that some legionaries requested transfers. Trained killers, uncomfortable guarding, forced pregnancy. But it worked. The next 3 facilities held. Spartacus probed the defenses, found them solid. The gladiator adapted. If he couldn't burn the facilities, he'd make them unprofitable. His forces destroyed the supply chains, burned the special grain shipments for pregnant slaves, poisoned the water supplies, killed the specialized overseers who managed breeding programs. The economic damage mounted faster than military casualties. Crassus's next innovation horrified even his allies. The brutal suppression tactics he ordered made previous Roman responses look gentle. Crucify them at the facilities, he commanded. Every captured rebel. Display them where the breeding women can see. Let them understand the price of resistance. The crosses went up around breeding centers, dozens, hundreds. Dying rebels positioned where pregnant slaves could watch their agony. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who oppose the system. This is what awaits anyone who dreams of freedom. Some women in the cells went mad from the constant screaming, but the tactic backfired. Seeing crucified rebels didn't break the women's spirits. It hardened them. They began small resistances, refusing food, inducing miscarriages, finding ways to damage the production Rome depended on. The facilities remained standing, but productivity plummeted. Crassus adapted again. Collective punishment. If any woman resisted, all suffered. Reduced rations, extended isolation. The facilities became even more hellish. But hellish facilities, still producing, were better than burned ruins producing nothing. The correspondence between Crassus and other estate owners grew increasingly desperate. They were winning militarily but losing economically. Every protected facility cost more to maintain than it produced. Guards' salaries, fortification expenses, the constant vigilance against infiltration. The breeding programs that had generated automatic profit now drained resources. But Crassus had one more strategy. The mass purchase orders tell the story. Thousands of new slaves bought from eastern markets, not for labor, for breeding. He was trying to replace the destroyed bloodlines wholesale, flooding facilities with fresh stock. The mortality rates were staggering. Women who hadn't been conditioned from birth resisted violently. Suicide rates spiked. The careful genetic programs, developed over generations, couldn't be quickly reconstructed. You couldn't just throw random slaves together and expect the same results. Yet Crassus persisted. His fortune, built on human misery, depended on restoring the system. He hired physicians to develop drugs that increased fertility, overseers who specialized in breaking resistant women, architects to design more secure facilities. The race between destruction and reconstruction consumed Italy. Spartacus burned facilities faster than Rome could build them. Crassus protected some, but at costs that negated profits. The economic mathematics that had made breeding profitable no longer balanced. The system was eating itself. Then Crassus realized a horrifying truth. Even if he won militarily, even if he crucified every rebel, the secret was out. 90,000 escaped slaves knew about the breeding facilities. They'd tell others. The knowledge would spread. Future rebellions would target the same infrastructure. The systematic ignorance that had protected the system was broken forever. His final letters to the Senate revealed his solution. Total war. Not just against Spartacus, but against the very idea of resistance. He would make the price of rebellion so terrible that no slave would dare dream of freedom for generations. But first, he had to win, and Spartacus kept burning facilities faster than Rome could protect them. The rebellion had found Rome's weakness. Not its armies, not its walls, its dependence on treating humans as renewable resources. Every destroyed facility was a wound that would bleed for decades. Every freed woman was a break in the chain of generational slavery. Crassus won the war and crucified 6,000 rebels along the Appian Way. But the breeding facilities Spartacus destroyed were gone forever. Their locations lost until modern technology started revealing Rome's darkest secrets. The ground-penetrating radar operator in Pompeii thought his equipment was malfunctioning. Those underground structures were too perfectly arranged, too systematic. Then he realized what he was looking at. 2010. A routine survey before new construction. The radar waves bounced back, showing corridors beneath a parking lot. Perfect rectangles, evenly spaced chambers. Too regular for natural formations. Too organized for storage. The operator called his supervisor. The supervisor called archaeologists. The archaeologists went silent when they saw the data. Dr. Elena Marchetti arrived within hours. 20 years excavating Pompeii. But she'd never seen layouts like this. The radar showed 40 underground rooms arranged in rows, each room exactly 3 meters by 2, each connected by corridors just wide enough for single-file movement. The precision made her stomach tighten. They started digging where the radar showed an entrance. Modern concrete gave way to ancient stone. The construction crew worked carefully now, everyone sensing they'd found something significant, something terrible. The first chamber still had the iron rings in the walls. Marchetti's flashlight beam caught the metal first. 4 rings, hip height, spaced for human wrists and ankles. The stone beneath showed wear patterns, grooves where chains had scraped for decades. She'd excavated enough Roman sites to recognize a cell. But this wasn't a normal prison. The dimensions were wrong. Too small to stand upright, too short to lie down fully. The ceiling forced anyone inside into permanent crouch. The feeding slot was positioned where someone kneeling could barely reach. Everything designed to break the human body into submission poses. But the radar revealed something else under the nursery chambers. The second level went deeper. More chambers, smaller ones. Marchetti's team worked through the night, headlamps cutting through darkness that had lasted 2 millennia. They found the narrow channels first. Stone gutters leading from the upper chambers down to, what? The disposal pit answered that question with tiny bones. Work stopped. The archaeologists switched to brushes, delicate tools for delicate atrocities, each fragment photographed, each position mapped. The infant skeletons lay where they'd been dropped. Some still showed impact fractures from hitting earlier bodies. The efficiency of horror preserved in calcium and stone. Marchetti cross-referenced with property records. This had been the villa of Quintus Hortensius, wealthy merchant, Senate connections. His legitimate business records survived in Pompey's archives. Grain trading, wine distribution, no mention of the underground chambers, no hint of what generated his real wealth. When they finally excavated the full complex, the evidence was undeniable. The breeding facility matched every detail from ancient sources. The domestication chambers with their isolation cells, the breeding rooms with their restraint fixtures, the birthing areas with drainage channels for blood and waste, the infant sorting room where someone had decided who lived and who went down the stone gutters. Modern technology revealed details Romans never intended to preserve. 3D imaging showed the complete layout. A factory floor plan for manufacturing humans, entry areas for new females, processing chambers for domestication, breeding cells arranged for efficient overseer access. Everything designed for maximum production with minimum movement. The documentary evidence emerged slowly. Wax tablets had melted in Vesuvius's heat, but the impressions remained in ash. Breeding schedules, productivity charts, female intake logs, the same careful record-keeping Crassus had pioneered, preserved by volcanic catastrophe. But Pompeii wasn't unique. Similar structures are being found across the former empire. Ground-penetrating radar has become standard for Italian construction projects. Not for treasures, for horrors. The signatures are unmistakable now. Underground, rectangular chambers. Systematic layouts. Always near wealthy villas. Always hidden from main buildings. Always with those terrible stone channels leading to disposal areas. Dr. Marchetti published her findings in 2013. Academic journals, public media. The evidence overwhelming. But each new discovery adds specificity to the horror. A facility in Spain specialized in breeding gladiators. One in Syria focused on domestic slaves. Regional variations on the same monstrous theme. The technology keeps improving. Isotope analysis of bones reveals diets. DNA extraction shows family relationships. Chemical analysis of stone exposes what fluids soaked in over decades. Each advancement in archaeology makes the evidence more damning, more personal, more impossible to deny. Construction projects across Europe now budget for potential breeding facility discoveries, standard line items, expected delays. The bureaucracy of uncovering atrocities has become routine. Fill out Form BF12 if you find suspicious underground chambers. Contact this department for infant remain protocols. Modern efficiency, cataloguing ancient efficiency. But the excavations reveal resistance too. Scratched messages in cells. Hidden objects that suggest tiny rebellions. Evidence that even in the deepest horror, humanity found ways to assert itself. These fragments become precious. Proof that the system never achieved total control. Digital databases grow with each discovery. Interactive maps showing facility locations. Statistical analysis revealing patterns. The infrastructure of slavery made visible through accumulated data. Scholars can now track breeding routes like trade routes, follow bloodlines like commercial networks. The Roman Empire's economic foundation exposed in brutal detail. Virtual reality reconstructions let people walk through these facilities, experience the dimensions, understand the psychological torture of spaces designed to break spirits. Museums debate how to display such evidence, how to educate without traumatizing, how to ensure never forget when forgetting would be mercy. Every new discovery adds another piece to the horrific puzzle, but they all point back to that October night in 73 BCE, when Spartacus stood in that breeding facility and made a choice that would echo through history. The flames had consumed 7 breeding facilities by dawn, but as Spartacus stood watching the smoke rise over another burning villa, he knew destruction alone wouldn't be enough. He had to make a choice that would define whether his rebellion died as a footnote or lived as a transformation. The Gaulish woman approached him through the smoke, one of the freed breeders, stomach still swollen with her final forced pregnancy. She'd appointed herself speaker for the others. Her voice came out raw from years of silence. "They're hunting us. All of us. The ones who know the locations." Spartacus turned from the flames. Behind the woman stood dozens more, some barely walking, some carrying infants born in the chaos of liberation, all looking at him with eyes that had forgotten how to hope. He understood their fear. These women were living maps to Rome's darkest infrastructure. Every one of them could guide his forces to another facility, another 100 women in chains, another pit full of tiny bones. Crassus would pay any price to silence them. "Then we split the knowledge," Spartacus decided. "Spread you among all 90,000. No group travels with more than 3 who know locations. Make it impossible to silence what you've seen." But the woman shook her head. "You don't understand. We're not just witnesses. We're evidence." She pulled back her sleeve. Brands covered her forearm. Not random marks of ownership. Sequential numbers. Breeding codes. Each woman carried her complete history burned into flesh. Which facilities she'd been cycled through. How many pregnancies. How many live births. Rome's record-keeping extended to human skin. The systematic horror of it made even Spartacus pause. These weren't just identification marks. They were quality control stamps. Productivity tracking burned into flesh. Any Roman who could read the code would know exactly what kind of breeder he was looking at. "Every slaver in Italy knows these marks," the woman continued. "We can't hide what we are, what we know, what we've survived." Around the burning villa, his rebels were already arguing. Some wanted to press north immediately, strike while Rome was confused. Others demanded they stay and burn every facility within 50 miles. The freed women complicated every plan, slowed every movement, ate resources without contributing to fighting strength. But Spartacus had learned something in that underground chamber. Sometimes the greatest strategic victory wasn't military. Sometimes it was forcing your enemy to reveal their true nature. "We don't hide you," he said finally. "We make you visible. All of you. Every brand, every scar, every story. Let Rome try to silence 90,000 witnesses scattered across Italy." The decision changed everything. Instead of a pure military force, the rebellion became a moving testimony. The branded women mixed with escaped gladiators. Their children played with the children of field slaves. The visible evidence of Rome's breeding programs marched openly through Italy. And Rome couldn't stand it. The Senate's emergency session erupted into chaos when they learned Spartacus's new strategy. These women weren't supposed to exist in public view. The breeding programs operated in careful shadow. Now hundreds of branded bellies marched under rebel banners, living proof of systematic atrocities. Crassus adapted with terrifying speed. New orders went out. Any branded woman found outside designated facilities faced immediate execution. No trial, no questions. The brands themselves became death sentences. He was trying to erase the evidence by killing the witnesses. But this created its own problems. Roman soldiers had to examine every captured woman for breeding brands, had to sort humans by their markings. The mechanical horror of it broke something in the legions. These weren't hardened criminals they were executing. These were pregnant women whose only crime was carrying proof of Rome's economics. Some legionaries refused orders, not many, but enough that Crassus had to institute decimation in 3 cohorts. 1 soldier in 10, beaten to death by their comrades for refusing to execute branded women. The discipline necessary to maintain the system revealed the system's monstrosity. Meanwhile, Spartacus had discovered something else in the captured documents: transportation schedules. The breeding facilities didn't operate in isolation. They shared stock, moved women between locations for genetic diversity, shipped infants to market centers, an entire hidden economy with its own trade routes. He started intercepting the shipments, freeing women in transit, but more importantly, capturing the documentation, bills of sale that listed humans like cattle, transport manifests showing children sorted by age and gender, correspondence between facilities discussing breeding strategies. Every document he captured he had copied, multiple versions, distributed among his followers. If Rome wanted to erase evidence, they'd have to kill everyone who'd seen it. The knowledge spread like plague through Italy's slave population, whispered confirmations of suspected horrors, documented proof of what many had guessed but never known for certain. The rebellion's character transformed with this knowledge. Field slaves who'd considered themselves fortunate learned about their sisters in underground cells. Household slaves discovered where their disappeared daughters had gone. The personal nature of the atrocity created a fury that military defeats couldn't quench. But it was the children who changed everything. Among the freed women were dozens of young girls, 12, 13, 14 years old, already showing signs of pregnancy, already carrying brands that marked them as third-generation breeding stock. When veteran gladiators saw these children girls the age of their own daughters, something fundamental shifted. The rebellion stopped being about freedom. It became about ending a system that would breed children to breed children. The circular horror of it, the generational trap, girls born in chains to birth more girls in chains, the mathematics of misery compounding through generations. Spartacus made another decision. Every breeding facility they found, they wouldn't just free the women. They'd hold trials, not Roman trials, slave trials. Let the branded women speak. Let them name names. Let them identify overseers and trainers and administrators. Create a record that couldn't be erased. The first trial happened at a villa near Capua. 300 rebels crowded into the courtyard. In the center, a wooden platform. On it, a woman with brands covering both arms. She spoke for 2 hours, named every man who'd touched her, described every pregnancy, listed every child taken. Her voice never wavered. She'd waited years to speak these truths. When she finished, the crowd was silent. Then another woman stepped forward. Then another. The trial became a cascade of testimony. Hours of accumulated horror spoken into open air. Rebels who'd thought they'd known slavery's worst learned otherwise. Strong men wept. Warriors who'd faced death in the arena vomited at descriptions of breeding protocols. But the trials served another purpose. They identified the apparatus. Not just who owned facilities, but who managed them. Who transported the women, who doctored the breeding records, who disposed of the infants, the entire administrative structure that made industrial breeding possible. Names were recorded, roles documented, a counter-bureaucracy of accountability. Spartacus couldn't reach every guilty party, but he could ensure their names lived in infamy, that somewhere, someone remembered what they'd done. The trials spread through the rebellion. Each freed facility held its own. The accumulated testimony created an oral history that couldn't be destroyed. Even if every document burned, even if every witness died, the stories had been heard by thousands, embedded in collective memory. Rome's response was predictable. They denied everything. These were lies, exaggerations, the fevered fantasies of simple slaves who couldn't understand agricultural necessities. The Senate issued statements about humane treatment, about economic requirements, about the natural order. But the brands didn't lie. The scars didn't exaggerate. The pregnant children weren't fantasies. As autumn turned to winter, Spartacus faced a crucial decision. His swollen forces, now approaching 100,000, couldn't maintain cohesion indefinitely. He could march on Rome itself, strike while the legions were scattered, possibly win a military victory that would echo through history. Or he could continue the systematic destruction of breeding infrastructure, keep burning facilities, keep freeing women, keep exposing the hidden economy of human manufacturing. A different kind of victory, one that attacked Rome's future instead of its present. His war council was divided. The Gauls wanted to march north, escape over the Alps. The Germans favored attacking Rome directly. The Thracians supported whatever Spartacus decided. But it was the freed women who swayed him. If you leave any facilities standing, the Gaulish woman told him, they'll rebuild them all within a generation. They'll learn from our escape, make them more secure. Breed women who can't even speak to share knowledge. You've wounded the beast. Now kill it. Spartacus looked at the maps. Red marks for destroyed facilities, black for known locations still operating. So many black marks. Months of work to reach them all. Months his forces would be vulnerable. Months Crassus would use to organize response. But he thought of that first night. The gladiators frozen in doorways. The silence of men who'd seen too much. The girl pressing hands over her belly. The systematic horror that made hardened killers drop their swords. We burn them all, he decided. Every last one. The decision meant splitting his forces. Smaller groups could move faster, strike more facilities, disperse before legions arrived. It was militarily risky, but strategically essential. Every facility left standing would restart. Every branded woman left in chains would birth more slaves. The mathematics demanded total destruction. Winter made everything harder. Pregnant women struggling through snow. Newborns needing warmth. The freed breeders slowing every movement, but also making every movement meaningful. This wasn't abstract rebellion anymore. It was personal liberation multiplied by thousands. The documents kept revealing new horrors. Shipping routes that moved infants like cargo. Pricing schedules that valued humans by age and gender. Letters between owners discussing breeding strategies with the casual tone of farmers planning crops. Each revelation hardened resolve. By spring, they'd destroyed 43 facilities, freed over 4,000 women, burned decades of breeding records. The economic damage was catastrophic. Estate owners were frantically buying slaves from Eastern markets, trying to maintain production. But you couldn't instantly recreate generations of selective breeding. More importantly, the knowledge was everywhere. Every slave in Italy now knew about the breeding facilities, knew to look for underground chambers, knew the signs, the architectural signatures, the branded women. The systematic nature of their oppression had been exposed beyond denial. Crassus gathered his forces for final confrontation. But Spartacus had already won the war that mattered. The breeding infrastructure that had taken generations to perfect lay in ruins. The carefully tracked bloodlines were scattered and lost. The economic foundation of slavery had been cracked. When the final battle came at the Silarus River, Spartacus fought knowing he'd already achieved something remarkable. Win or lose militarily, he'd forced Rome to reveal itself, made the hidden visible, turned systematic horror into undeniable history. He died in that battle, fought so fiercely his body was never identified among the dead. But the women he'd freed lived, scattered across Italy, carrying their brands and their stories, living evidence of what Rome had been, what it had done, what it could never fully rebuild. Crassus crucified 6,000 rebels along the Appian Way, but he couldn't crucify knowledge, couldn't execute memory, couldn't rebuild infrastructure designed for ignorance once ignorance was broken. The breeding facilities that survived operated differently, more carefully, less efficiently, always aware that another Spartacus might rise. The economic damage persisted for decades. Rome had to rely more on conquest, on piracy, on trade. The automatic reproduction of slavery had been disrupted. The mathematical certainty of human livestock shattered, all because one gladiator looked into underground cells and decided some victories were worth any price. 2,000 years later, archaeologists keep finding evidence. Each excavation confirms what Spartacus saw, what he chose to destroy, what he forced into history. The bones still witness. The brands still testify. The ruins still accuse. But they also remember that October night when gladiators broke down doors, when chains fell away, when women emerged from underground chambers into starlight, when someone finally said the only words that mattered, "You're free." The legacy lived in every freed woman who told her story, every child who grew up knowing their history, every document that survived to indict an empire. Spartacus had lost the war but won something larger. He'd made it impossible to pretend the horror hadn't happened. Modern excavations continue to prove him right. Each breeding facility uncovered, each mass grave documented, each tiny skeleton catalogued. The evidence accumulates, beyond denial, beyond excuse, beyond forgetting. The fire still burns in those ruins. Not literal flames, but the heat of testimony. the warmth of recognition, the light that exposes what power once hidden. Every archaeological discovery adds fuel. Every bone speaks. Every brand remembers. 2 millennia haven't cooled that fire. If anything, modern technology has made it burn brighter. DNA evidence, chemical analysis, digital reconstruction, all confirming what a gladiator saw in torchlight, what he chose to burn rather than tolerate. The breeding facilities are gone, but their absence speaks louder than their presence ever did. Empty foundations where horror once thrived, ash layers where records once tracked misery, scattered stones where cells once held women. Spartacus gave his life for many things: freedom, dignity, revenge. But perhaps his greatest gift was this: he made it impossible to forget. The breeding facilities had operated in shadow for generations. He dragged them into light and burned them there. Public, visible, undeniable. The women he freed carried that light forward, in their stories, in their children, in their refusal to be silent about what they'd survived. They became living torches, illuminating Roman darkness wherever they went. Some established new communities, others vanished into the general population, but all carried the knowledge, all bore the brands, all remembered the cells and the chains and the children taken. Their memories became history, their scars became evidence, their survival became testimony. Crassus could crucify bodies. He couldn't crucify truth. The Roman economy never fully recovered its efficiency. The breeding programs that restarted operated under constraints. Too many people knew, too many watched, too many remembered. The automatic certainty of generational slavery had been broken by awareness. But the deepest impact was psychological. Every Roman who owned slaves now knew that their property knew. The comfortable ignorance was gone. The careful compartmentalization shattered. Pregnant slaves weren't agricultural assets anymore. They were women who might burn down your villa if they found the chance. Fear replaced efficiency. Control required more violence. The mathematics of slavery shifted when slaves understood the complete system, not just their own oppression but the industrial scale of it. The breeding facilities had depended on ignorance. Spartacus had destroyed that forever. His rebellion failed militarily but succeeded historically. Every future slave revolt would remember. Every future resistance would know where to strike. The infrastructure of oppression had been mapped by its victims. The knowledge became power, waiting for the next opportunity. The archaeological evidence confirms this disruption. Post-Spartacus facilities show different construction. More guards, better fortification, higher walls. The architecture of fear replacing the architecture of efficiency. Rome had learned that some secrets couldn't survive exposure. Each modern discovery adds another piece, another confirmation, another witness emerging from soil and stone. The ground remembers what documents tried to forget. The bones testify where texts stay silent. The ruins speak truths that power wanted buried. Spartacus lost his war but won his argument, that some systems are too monstrous to reform, too evil to regulate, too horrible to allow. His solution was fire, complete destruction, absolute rejection. The gladiator who'd been forced to kill for entertainment chose to burn the machinery that made such entertainment possible. In the end, that may have been his greatest victory. Not the battles won or the Romans killed, but the simple, irreversible fact that he'd seen the worst of Rome and chosen to destroy it utterly. No negotiation, no compromise, just fire-consuming darkness. The flames he lit still burn in every excavation, every discovery, every confirmation of what he revealed. 2,000 years later, we're still finding evidence of what he fought, still counting tiny skeletons, still measuring pelvic damage, still reading brands on ancient bones. Each discovery proves him right. The breeding facilities were real. The horror was systematic. The evil was structural. And sometimes, when faced with such darkness, the only answer is complete destruction. No careful reform, no gradual change, just fire. Spartacus gave that answer, paid for it with his life. But the answer outlived him, outlived Rome, outlives still in every ruin that confirms his choice. The breeding facilities are gone. In their place, memory, evidence, truth, and the certain knowledge that one gladiator looked into the darkness of empire and chose to burn it all down. His fire still lights the way, still reveals the hidden, still warms those who refuse to accept the unacceptable. 2,000 years. The flames still burn. The evidence still emerges. The truth still sets people free.